Two fighters leave the ground at the same moment, low, fast, hugging the ridgeline to stay below the radar horizon. From the Makran shore, in the gray pre-dawn light over the Gulf of Oman, they look like hunters. They are tracking a single large aircraft orbiting slowly to the south, slow-turning, 4 engines, a massive radar return at low altitude. An AC-130 gunship. To the pilots climbing off that coastal strip, the math looks good. A lumbering platform, no obvious escort, a shot. 4 minutes later, both of those fighters are tumbling into the Gulf. What happened in those 4 minutes is not a story about the AC-130's guns. They never fired. It is a story just about the aircraft nobody on the Iranian side was watching closely enough, an E-2D Hawkeye, orbiting high and quiet far to the southeast, whose radar had been tracking those F-5s since the moment their wheels left the runway. By the time the Iranian pilots committed to their attack profile, the trap had already closed. They just didn't know it yet. Stay with this, because the way this intercept unfolded tells you something fundamental about how the U.S. Navy fights in confined, contested airspace, and why a radar plane that never fires a shot is often the most dangerous thing in the sky. Geography matters here, so let's place this precisely. The Gulf of Oman sits at the eastern approach to the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow corridor through which roughly a fifth of the world's traded oil moves every day. To the north lies the Iranian coastline, and specifically the Makran coast, a long, arid stretch of rock and sand running east toward Pakistan, dotted with small airstrips and coastal facilities used by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Air Force, the IRGF, and regular Iranian Air Force units. It is not the most sophisticated air defense environment in the region, but it has layers, and the mountains that back the coast give natural radar masking to aircraft departing at low altitude heading south. This is exactly what the two F-5 pilots used. The F-5, specifically the Iranian variant, a mix of original F-5E Tiger IIs and the domestically modified Azarakhsh and Seika derivatives, belongs to a different era. The United States sold them to the Shah's Iran before 1979. After the revolution, Iran kept flying them, cannibalizing spare parts, reverse engineering components, and in some cases building indigenous versions. By any modern standard, the F-5 is outclassed. Basic radar, not supersonic and sustained flight, almost no viable beyond visual range capability. Against an FC-18 Super Hornet in a straight engagement, it has almost no path to survival. But the Iranian pilots that morning were not planning a straight engagement. They were planning a bounce, a classic fighter ambush, closing fast from the blind quarter before the target can react, using terrain masking to compress the warning time to near zero. Against a slow-moving AC-130 orbiting at medium-low altitude, that logic holds up on paper. The gunship is not a fighter. Its sensors point at the ground, not the sky. Its self-defense is passive. Flares, chaff, radar warning receivers. It cannot maneuver like a combat jet. Get into its rear quadrant within missile range before anyone knows you're coming, and you have a shot. That was the plan. What makes this scenario interesting, and not entirely far-fetched, is that it wasn't without precedent. Iranian fast jets have made intercept approaches on U.S. surveillance and maritime patrol aircraft before, typically stopping short of weapons release but making the intent clear. What was different this morning was the commitment level. These two F-5s were not flying harassment. Their closure geometry, altitude, airspeed, all of it said actual intercept attempt. Someone had decided this was the moment to test whether a U.S. AC-130 was as vulnerable as it looked. The answer was not what they expected. The E-2D Advanced Hawkeye is easy to underestimate if you don't know what it actually does. It looks awkward, a mid-sized turboprop with a massive rotodome sitting on top of the fuselage, rotating slowly, the silhouette of something designed by committee. It carries no weapons. It cannot go supersonic. Raw performance-wise, it is roughly comparable to a regional airliner. And yet, in the context of U.S. Navy carrier aviation, the E-2D is arguably the most consequential aircraft in the air at any given moment, because it sees everything, and it turns that picture into action faster than any other asset in the battle group. The AMP-9 radar fitted to the E-2D is a UHF band system with overland and overwater detection capability that extends well beyond what shipborne radar can achieve from sea level. More importantly, it has sophisticated low-altitude track capability. It can pick up aircraft flying low. Using terrain masking, that would be invisible to conventional radar looking over the horizon. When those two F-5s lifted off from their coastal strip and pushed their noses down to hug the Makran ridgeline, they were invisible to most of the sensor picture in the Gulf. They were not invisible to the Hawkeye. The E-2D crew had a contact on the F-5s within seconds of takeoff. The classification was fast, two small fast movers, low altitude, military performance envelope, departing the Makran coast on a southerly heading that plotted directly toward the AC-130's orbit point. The intercept geometry was obvious. The Hawkeye does not wait for certainty in a situation like this. The crew pushes the information, contact, bearing, altitude, closure rate, time to merge, out across the tactical data link to every asset in the network simultaneously. On the screen of every fighter pilot, every ship's combat system, every relevant platform in range, the picture updates. The two F-5 contacts appear. The threat vector resolves. The response calculates itself. The F-15 Super Hornets, the AC-130's escort pair, holding their own orbit position some distance from the gunship and running in emissions control, quiet so as not to advertise their presence, received the vector from the Hawkeye before the F-5 pilots had climbed to 5,000 feet. Put yourself in the cockpit of one of those Super Hornets for a moment. You've been holding position in the dark, running a loose combat air patrol, watching your radar warning receiver more than your radar because you're trying not to give away that you're there. Your wingman is 2 miles off your port quarter. The AC-130 you're covering is orbiting 12 miles to your northwest, doing exactly what it's supposed to, looking like a soft target, slow and predictable. Then the Hawkeye calls it. Two bandits, bearing north-northwest, climbing through 8,000 feet. Closure approximately 450 knots. Time to AC-130 approximately 4 minutes. 4 minutes, not much time, but enough if you're already positioned, already briefed, already loaded. The Super Hornet pilots pushed their throttles up and turned north, staying below the Hawkeye's assigned altitude block, keeping their radar in standby to avoid tipping the F-5s that something was moving to meet them. The Hawkeye owned the picture. The fighters just had to get to the geometry the Hawkeye was drawing for them. One detail that stuck with me when working through how this develops. The F-5 pilots almost certainly knew the AC-130 had a radar warning receiver. They almost certainly expected some chance of detection. What they may have calculated, or hoped, was that the warning would come too late for any response to matter. A slow aircraft receiving a warning cannot run. It cannot maneuver aggressively. The most it can do is call for help and start defensive countermeasures. If you are fast and close enough, help arrives after the engagement is already over. That calculation had one catastrophic flaw. Help was not coming from somewhere distant. Help was already there. The F-5 led and his wingman crossed the surf line heading south at low altitude, then began climbing as they closed on the AC-130's orbit. Standard bounce geometry, terrain masking on the approach, then pitching up in the final phase to get a missile firing solution from the rear quadrant. The AC-130's radar warning receiver would have started going at this point as the F-5's radar came up in search mode. Inside the gunship, the crew would have been calling the threat, deploying countermeasures, pushing the aircraft into whatever evasive maneuvering it could manage. The AC-130 is not helpless. It carries AN/AQ-24 Nemesis directed infrared countermeasures, a system that actively jams infrared-guided missiles. It has radar warning, chaff, and flares. Its crew trains for exactly this. But the primary defensive plan for an AC-130 in a permissive to semi-permissive environment is not its own systems. It is the fighter escort. And the fighter escort was now 2 minutes out, bracket position above and to the east of the F-5's attack axis. The Hawkeye kept the picture clean the whole way through. Altitude, speed, geometry. The E-2D was running this intercept like a chess match where every piece was already on the right square. The Super Hornet lead called the F-5s on radar, active now. No more reason for emissions control at approximately 12 miles. The AIM-120 AMRAAM was already on a firing solution. The range was closing fast. The F-5s, climbing hard and focused on the AC-130 ahead of them, had seconds, at best, before the geometry that made them hunters turned them into targets. Worth saying plainly what most analysts won't say directly. The Iranian decision to use F-5s, aircraft out of production for decades, without modern radar warning suites, without data link integration, without the self-protection systems that give a modern fighter even a marginal chance in a beyond visual range environment, was not just a tactical gamble. It was a reflection of the fundamental equipment gap between the IRGF's frontline inventory and the platforms they are being asked to contest. An F-5 pilot in this environment is not flying a fighter, he is flying a liability. And whoever authorized this mission either did not understand that gap or did not care about the men in those cockpits. The AIM-120 AMRAAM, the Advanced Medium-Range Air-to-Air Missile, is the primary beyond visual range weapon of U.S. fighter aviation. Active radar homing, meaning once it hits the terminal phase, it does not require the launching aircraft to maintain radar lock. Range in excess of 60 miles in optimal conditions. Maneuvering capability that outclasses the evasive options available to a subsonic F-5. The Super Hornet lead fired first, a single AIM-120 off the left wing rail, the missile accelerating on a pursuit curve that the F-5 lead had no realistic answer to. The F-5 lead may have seen the launch. His radar warning receiver would have triggered. At that range, at that closure rate, there is a decision point that arrives very fast. Brake hard, deploy countermeasures, and accept that you are probably not surviving this, but might get lucky. Or continue the attack and accept the missile. There is no good option. That is what a properly executed beyond visual range intercept looks like. The first AIM-120 found the F-5 lead at approximately 9 miles. The detonation, proximity fuse, rod warhead was catastrophic to the airframe. The aircraft did not recover. It came apart in the air and the debris began falling into the Gulf of Oman. The second F-5, the wingman, broke for the deck the instant he saw or heard the threat. Trained response, and it was fast. He pushed the nose down and went for the wave tops, trying to defeat the second missile's radar with sea clutter, trying to get back under the radar horizon, trying to make the coast. The surf line was close. Maybe he thought he could make it. Here's what the Hawkeye saw. The second F-5 descending hard, running north less than 8 miles from the coast. And here's what the geometry showed. The second Super Hornet, already repositioned, already in a firing solution, already receiving updated track data from the E-2D in real time. The second AIM-120 was in the air before the F-5 wingman crossed the halfway point to the surf line. A beyond visual range missile fired at a target running for the deck, trying to use sea clutter, in the hands of a modern weapon with active radar homing and a sophisticated fuse, not a guaranteed kill, but close. The F-5's electronic warfare suite, whatever remained functional on an aircraft of that vintage, was not in the same league as what was hunting it. The second AIM-120 intercepted the F-5 wingman approximately 3 miles short of the Iranian coast. The aircraft did not make it back over the surf line. Both jets went into the Gulf of Oman. The AC-130 continued its orbit. Its guns were never used. There is a tendency, in the aftermath of an engagement like this, to focus on hardware, missile kill probability numbers, radar ranges. Those things matter. But what this intercept actually demonstrates is something more fundamental about how integrated, networked air combat works when one side has it and the other doesn't. The F-5 pilots flew into a situation where the information gap was total. They had their own eyes, their own radar, their own situational awareness, and they believed that was enough to execute a surprise attack on a slow target. What they did not account for was that a separate aircraft, high overhead, operating on a frequency and at an altitude that gave it a picture of the entire engagement space, had been watching them since before they rolled down the runway. And that aircraft had already repositioned the fighters that would destroy them before the F-5 pilots even reached the coast. From the Iranian pilot's perspective, the attack probably felt viable right up until the radar warning receiver screamed. They may have believed they had closed to within firing range of the AC-130 without triggering a response. They were wrong, and they never got a chance to understand why. The 4-minute gap between their takeoff and their destruction is not defined by reaction time. It is defined by information. The US side had the full picture. The Iranian side had a fraction of it. In modern air combat, that asymmetry is almost always decisive. The cost to the US side, 2 AMRAAM-120 AMRAAM missiles, against 2 airframes representing a meaningful fraction of Iran's operational coastal patrol fighter force in that sector. What this engagement reveals about the strategic logic, or the absence of it, on the Iranian side is hard to ignore. The IRGA's use of F-5 variants in contested airspace adjacent to a U.S. carrier-based air defense network is not a decision made from strength. It is a decision made from the corner a degraded inventory puts you in. You use what you have. But using what you have in this environment against this opponent is not a strategy. It is an accelerated path to having less. The E-2D Hawkeye deserves more than a footnote here, because it is the part of this story that gets the least screen time but carries the most weight. The E-2D Advanced Hawkeye is the latest variant of a platform that has been flying off U.S. carriers since the early 1960s. The D model brings the ANA-9 radar, a generational leap over its predecessor in low-altitude detection, overland clutter rejection, and track capacity. It can simultaneously manage hundreds of tracks. It can support multiple intercepts at once. It can fuse its picture with shipborne sensors, airborne sensors, and space-based assets through the Integrated Naval Tactical Terminal. It is, in effect, a flying battle management center. In this engagement, the E-2D performed 3 things the fighters could not do for themselves. First, it detected the F-5s while they were still behind terrain masking, before any other sensor in the network had them. Second, it vectored the Super Hornets to a position that maximized their weapons envelope while keeping them invisible to the attacking aircraft. Third, it maintained continuous track updates throughout the engagement, ensuring the second AIM-120 had a current, accurate firing solution on a target actively maneuvering to survive. Without the Hawkeye, this engagement looks different. Without the Hawkeye, the AC-130's first warning of the F-5s might have come at 4 miles or 2 miles, or as an infrared signature off the bow. The fighter escort would have had less time, less information, a harder geometry. The bounce might have worked. With the Hawkeye, the bounce never had a chance. Here's the part that seems counterintuitive on the surface, but once you understand the physics, it explains everything. The radar that decides the outcome of a modern air battle is almost never on the aircraft doing the shooting, is on a separate platform, built specifically to see, positioned to maximize its field of view, doing nothing but building the picture and feeding it to the shooters. The FC-18 Super Hornet is a devastating weapons platform, but it operates at full potential only when an E-2D is telling it exactly where to point. Strip the Hawkeye out, and you get a capable fighter operating on partial information. add it back, and the shooter already has a solution before the target knows the engagement has started. This is the architecture the U.S. Navy has been building and refining for 60 years. It does not make highlight reels the way a missile launch does, but it is the reason 4 minutes was enough. Now consider the broader context in which this kind of engagement happens. The Gulf of Oman is not a quiet piece of water. It is the eastern approach to the most consequential maritime choke point on the planet. Through the Strait of Hormuz to the west, through these waters to the east, moves the oil that heats homes and fuels industry from Tokyo to Rotterdam. The United States has maintained a continuous naval presence in this region for decades specifically because the cost of losing it, even temporarily, is measured not in military terms but in the global economy's ability to function. Iran understands this. The Xerxes maritime and air harassment strategy is built around this understanding. Not the belief that they can defeat the U.S. Navy in a conventional engagement, but the belief that enough friction, enough unpredictability, enough cost imposition through small actions can shift the strategic calculus over time. Every harassment of a shipping lane, every approach toward a U.S. asset, every mine, every fast boat swarm, every scrambled intercept, it is all part of a coercive strategy aimed not at winning a war but at making the presence of U.S. forces expensive enough that the calculation changes. The problem with that strategy, as this engagement shows, is that the cost runs both ways. 2 F-5s destroyed is 2 F-5s Iran cannot easily replace. Iran's air forces operated under sanctions that made spare parts, modern avionics, and new airframes essentially inaccessible through legitimate channels for nearly half a century. Every aircraft lost is a problem the system cannot solve quickly. Every pilot who does not return is a loss the training pipeline cannot rapidly absorb. The harassment strategy assumes a tolerance for attrition that may hold with fast boats and cheap drones, but becomes deeply costly when it involves manned aircraft. Did the F-5 lead believe 2 old fighters could close before the escort reacted, or did he see the Hawkeye's net too late? Based on how fast the intercept developed, the answer is probably that he never saw it at all. The first indication that something had gone catastrophically wrong was almost certainly the radar warning tone at a range where the geometry had already been decided. There was no moment of realization, no tactical adjustment that could have changed the outcome. The Hawkeye had closed the trap before the F-5s ever committed to the attack axis. That is what a well-designed kill chain looks like from the inside, if you are on the losing end of it. 2 aircraft from a force that cannot replace them easily. 2 pilots, almost certainly. There are no ejection reports consistent with successful egress at low altitude in a high G brake turn, and the second aircraft's final profile made a successful ejection extremely unlikely. 2 trained aviators who flew into a fight that was already over before the merge. There will be no official Iranian acknowledgement. Iran does not announce losses of this kind through official channels. Incident will either go officially silent or get explained as a technical malfunction or training accident. The political cost of admitting that 2 of the Islamic Republic's fighters were destroyed by a U.S. Navy intercept before they could fire a single round is not something the system absorbs easily. But the operational community knows. The units that fly in this airspace, the commanders who brief the threat, the pilots who fly the CAP missions, they will absorb this into their picture of the environment. The lesson is not complicated. A U.S. AC-130 operating in the Gulf of Oman is not undefended, regardless of what it looks like on radar. The network protecting it is invisible until the moment it fires, and by then, the geometry has already been decided. One question I keep coming back to when I look at engagements like this: at what point in their attack profile did the F-5 lead first understand that the geometry was wrong? Was there a moment, a warning tone, a radar contact from an unexpected bearing, a sudden awareness of something moving to the east, where he understood what he had flown into? Or did the AIM-120 arrive before any of that resolved? We may never know. What we do know is that the outcome was consistent with every aspect of how the U.S. Navy has designed its air defense architecture to function. The AC-130 gunship, the aircraft that served as the bait in this engagement, intentionally or not, deserves a moment here. The AC-130 is built for a completely different mission than the one it found itself at the center of. It is a fire support and close air support aircraft derived from the C-130 Hercules transport, carrying weapons optimized for ground attack. A 105mm howitzer, a 40mm Bofors cannon, a 25mm Gatling gun in some variants. It orbits low and slow over ground targets, builds a detailed sensor picture with electro-optical and infrared systems, and delivers sustained precision fires in ways no fast mover can match. Extraordinarily effective at what it does, not designed to survive a beyond visual range air-to-air engagement. The fact that the AC-130 in this engagement continued its orbit after the intercept, guns never used. Mission uninterrupted is the clearest possible statement about what the E-2D and FCA-18 team actually accomplished. The asset that was the intended target never had to take action to defend itself. The threat was eliminated at range. Before it reached the AC-130's defensive perimeter, before the gunship crew had to make any decision other than continuing their assigned tasking. That is the ideal outcome in protected airspace operations. The asset at risk should never know it was in danger because the defensive system removed the threat before danger materialized. Here's the take that will probably get some pushback. The Iranian military's continued use of manned F-5 fighters and direct harassment approaches against U.S. assets in this region is not boldness. It is a failure to adapt. There is a version of Iran's coercive air strategy, conducted with appropriate platforms using standoff weapons, that creates real friction at manageable cost to itself. The choice to put F-5 pilots in harm's way against a networked U.S. air defense architecture reflects either a dangerous overestimation of their survivability or a decision-making process that does not weight pilot lives appropriately in the strategic calculation. Either possibility is troubling for different reasons. What this 4-minute engagement ultimately tells us is not about the F-5 or even about the AC-130. It is about the architecture of advantage. Modern air combat is decided before the first shot by who has the better picture of the battle space, who sees more, sees it sooner, and can translate that information into targeting solutions faster than the adversary can react. The E-2D Hawkeye is the nerve system of that architecture in the U.S. carrier air wing. The FC-18 Super Hornet is the arm that delivers the outcome the nerve system has already calculated. The AC-130 was never the key player in this engagement. It was the stage. For the two Iranian pilots who climbed off the Makran coast that morning and turned south over the Gulf of Oman, the stage was set against them before their wheels left the ground. The Hawkeye was already watching. The Super Hornets were already positioned. The AIM-120s were already loaded. All that remained was for the geometry to close, and 4 minutes was all it took. Team AIM-120 or Team F-5 with a prayer, drop your read on this intercept in the comments. And if you want to understand how the E-2D sensor picture changes the math in the Strait of Hormuz itself, where the geometry gets even tighter, that breakdown is coming next. Don't miss it.